The tide of war had undeniably turned against Germany, and across the vast, sun-drenched heart of Texas, the United States was quietly preparing for a wave of prisoners it had never anticipated in such overwhelming numbers. Into dusty railroad stations rolled freight trains, their cargo, weary German soldiers who had once marched confidently through the streets of Paris and Warsaw. Now, they peered through the narrow slats of boxcars at a landscape so immense it felt utterly surreal. They braced themselves for punishment, starvation, and vengeance. They expected to be treated as nothing less than monsters. Instead, what awaited them was an unsettling tableau of order, efficiency, and the bewildering calm of a people who seemed to harbor no animosity. As the train doors hissed open at Camp Bowie, nestled near Brownwood, Texas, the first sensation to assault them was the heat. It was a dry, pulsing warmth that carried the distinct scent of mesquite and diesel, an alien perfume compared to the battlefields of Europe. Beyond the platform, rows of white wooden barracks stretched with a geometric precision, neat as chess pieces, each window framed in army green. Barbed wire glinted fiercely in the harsh sunlight, yet behind its intimidating coils, there were no bayonets poised or snarling guards. Only American soldiers, comfortably clad in khaki, casually sipping coffee from tin mugs. Some offered tentative, curious smiles as the Germans shuffled down the ramps in silence, their boots crunching on the unfamiliar red dust. For these bewildered prisoners, it was akin to stepping onto another planet entirely. Their initial impression was one of profound confusion. These were certainly not the swaggering, cruel victors depicted in their propaganda posters. There was no hint of vengeance in their demeanor. A young sergeant, barely 20, called out in halting German, "Welcome, fellows. You'll get food and shower soon." A few prisoners of war laughed bitterly, convinced it was a cruel jest. But then came the steaming bowls of beef stew, thick slices of white bread, and cups of hot coffee served from large, insulated urns. It was no trick. The Americans were feeding them before even beginning interrogations. For men who had subsisted on moldy bread in the field, this unexpected bounty felt simultaneously merciful and deeply humiliating. The camp itself operated with the precision and amenities of a small, functioning city. Electric lights glowed brightly in the evenings. The showers delivered hot water, a luxury unknown for months. There were regular medical inspections, comprehensive dental checks, and even lectures on camp rules, delivered through translators who spoke impeccable German. "You are soldiers, not criminals," one interpreter stated clearly. "Behave with discipline, and you will be treated with respect." That singular sentence echoed in their minds, a radical departure from everything they believed. Respect for prisoners? It flew in the face of all they'd been told about the Americans, the supposed barbarians who had unleashed incendiary bombs on Hamburg and Dresden. Some of the men still bore the sun-faded insignia of the Afrika Korps on their uniforms, remnants of desert campaigns. Others had fought in Italy or Normandy, their eyes hollowed by months of relentless retreat. Oberleutnant Becker, an officer among them, later confided in his diary, "They do not shout at us. They do not strike us. They even apologize when counting us. Perhaps they wish to shame us with kindness." To a man rigorously trained in obedience and fear, this unexpected civility was profoundly disarming. The enemy, it seemed, was behaving as if the war were already over. Days drifted by in a strange, almost surreal routine. Mornings were filled with work details, clearing brush, repairing fences, or helping local farmers pick cotton and mend barns. The guards, though watchful, maintained a relaxed demeanor. They spoke of baseball, of girls back home, of mundane American life. They allowed the prisoners to read German-language newspapers and even form orchestras. It was a bizarre kind of civilization existing behind barbed wire, leaving the men unsure whether to feel grateful or subtly mocked. One night, Becker overheard two Americans arguing about baseball scores and found himself chuckling quietly. The sound startled him. It had been many months since he had heard laughter that wasn't forced or derisive. Yet, beneath this facade of civility, An underlying unease persisted, something the Germans couldn't quite articulate. It manifested at night when the camp fell silent. Beyond the outermost fences, in the vast, rolling darkness, came the low, heavy sound of measured breathing. Then a muffled growl, a sound too rhythmic to be truly wild, too close to be distant. Men turned restlessly in their bunks, straining to listen. "Hund," someone whispered, the German word for dog. "Dogs!" By morning, rumors had swept through the barracks. The Americans had dogs guarding the perimeter. Not just any dogs, but massive, disciplined creatures, mostly unseen. The prisoners peered through cracks in the fence during roll call, scanning for any movement. They saw only shifting shadows and the occasional glint of eyes deep in the grass. Then, one afternoon, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in fiery hues, they caught their first unambiguous glimpse. A patrol passed by, 2 American MPs, and striding purposefully beside them, 2 enormous black and tan dogs. Muscles rippled under their sleek coats, the animals moving with an almost silent grace. They did not bark. Every step was perfectly matched to their handlers. For the German soldiers, the sight struck them with the force of a physical blow. They recognized that formidable shape, that powerful gait, those deep-chested silhouettes that were so distinctly linked to their homeland. Rottweilers. For a long, stunned moment, no one spoke. Becker froze, his breath caught somewhere between awe and a profound sense of shame. "Mein Gott," someone muttered behind him, the words heavy with disbelief. "They're ours." The Americans called them by English names like Rex and Duke, but their lineage was unmistakable. German dogs, now bearing American insignia. The irony cut deep. This was the same breed once used to patrol concentration camps, now protecting captives from harm. It was a living, breathing symbol that their world had indeed been turned upside down. That night, the camp buzzed with uneasy conversation, a cacophony of conflicting emotions. Some prisoners were outright angry. How could the Americans so brazenly twist a proud German breed into a mere tool of their victory? Others, however, saw something even more unsettling. The Americans treated these powerful dogs not with fear or brutality, but with genuine affection. They patted them, spoke softly to them, even shared bits of their rations. These formidable beasts were not just symbols of raw domination. They embodied a more subtle control, a quiet, disciplined strength. One guard was seen scratching affectionately behind a Rottweiler's ear, and the animal leaned into his leg with palpable trust. Becker watched from a distance, a tightness in his chest. Even the dogs, he thought, are freer here than men were in Germany. In the weeks that followed, the dogs became an enduring, almost elemental presence. Their rhythmic footfalls marked the passage of time. Their silent patrols drew invisible lines, sharply delineating the boundaries between captivity and a freedom that was just beyond reach. The Germans slowly began to respect them, and in some unspoken way, even to envy them. And at night, when the wind carried faint, distant barks across the vast prairie, men who had once dutifully shouted, "Heil Hitler," now whispered to each other about the sheer absurdity of it all. The Reich collapsing under relentless bombs, while its loyal hounds guarded fields of Texas cotton. By mid-August, more trains arrived, bringing new prisoners who inevitably asked the same questions, stared at the same powerful animals, and felt the same stinging disbelief. Word circulated through the camp that these dogs were fed choice steak scraps, brushed daily, and regularly treated by veterinarians. Some Germans scoffed bitterly. "They care more for a dog than Berlin cared for its wounded," one remarked. Others fell silent, knowing with a chilling certainty that it was true. For the first time in years, many of these men began to grapple with a profound question. Was strength truly measured in cruelty, or in discipline, restraint, and an unexpected mercy? When the bugle sounded for lights out, Becker lay awake, staring blankly at the ceiling. Outside, he could faintly hear the soft jingle of a chain, the pad of paws on the dry earth. The thought that something inherently German had found a new home in the land of its conquerors was at once unbearable and strangely comforting. He closed his eyes, the sound slowly fading into the vast Texas night. Somewhere beyond the fence, a Rottweiler paused, its head cocked, listening to the same wind that carried whispers from across the distant ocean. And for the first time, Becker wondered not merely how he had lost the war, but more profoundly, what kind of people he had lost it to. Morning arrived with a pale wash of Texas light, the kind that seemed to soften everything except the unvarnished truth. Inside Camp Bowie, the prisoners stood in line for roll call. The air was already warming, and fine red dust rose from the ground like faint smoke. Beyond the fence, they observed the same patrols as yesterday. American soldiers, tall and casual, their rifles slung easily across their shoulders. But this morning, the eyes of the camp were not fixed on the guards. They were riveted on the animals walking silently beside them. Two immense Rottweilers, their coats gleaming black and copper under the brightening sun, their movements deliberate and almost spectral, like shadows given tangible form. For the Germans, it was like staring into a reflection of themselves, tragically warped by defeat. The breed was unmistakably theirs, born in the rolling hills of Rottweil, originally bred by butchers as powerful Metzger Hund to drive cattle and guard valuable gold. Symbols of German discipline and uncompromising power. To see them now on American leashes, responding obediently to English commands, was a small, fur and muscle-wrapped humiliation. Even our dogs have changed sides, one prisoner muttered bitterly, his voice barely audible above the morning wind. The guard called out friendly commands, "Heel, Duke," "Seat," "Thanks," as if addressing cherished old friends. The dogs obeyed with an almost mechanical precision, their intelligent eyes fixed on the horizon. They did not growl, did not bare teeth, nor did they need to. Their quiet, self-assured calm was far more unnerving than any overt hostility. Becker watched them from his place in line, the stiff collar of his tattered field jacket scratching at his neck. He himself had once trained dogs just like these near Munich for patrol duties along the Danube. His own dogs had been fierce, loyal, and unflinching. But these animals possessed an eerie patience, a quiet intelligence that seemed almost human in its depth. Later that day, Becker was assigned to a fence repair crew along the northern perimeter. The sun beat down relentlessly, baking the wire as they replaced loose posts and painstakingly tightened strands with pliers. Across the divide, an American MP strolled by, a Rottweiler padding effortlessly beside him. The man was humming a low, tuneless melody, while the dog's sharp eyes meticulously followed Becker's every move. There was no snarl, not even a twitch of aggression, just the steady, unwavering gaze of a creature utterly certain of its authority. It wasn't the explicit threat of violence that held Becker transfixed. It was the sheer control. In Germany, he reflected, control was born of fear. Here, it seemed to stem from profound discipline. As the MP approached, he offered a polite nod, tipping his cap. "Hot one today," he said in slow, deliberate English, as if attempting to bridge the cultural chasm. Becker didn't reply. His English was still rudimentary, but he keenly observed the man's hand resting lightly on the dog's back, not as a command, but as a subtle gesture of reassurance. The Rottweiler's ears flicked, its muscles visibly relaxing beneath the touch. That small, tender interaction unsettled Becker more profoundly than a rifle pointed at his chest ever could have. When the patrol had passed, Becker's work partner, a farmer from Bavaria named Newman, exhaled sharply. "Do you see that?" he whispered, his voice hushed. "They treat them like soldiers." Becker offered no reply. He watched the animal's powerful silhouette vanish beyond the curve of the fence, its tail steady, head held high. The Germans, he mused, had forged their dogs into weapons. The Americans, it seemed, had fashioned theirs into guardians. Somehow, the difference felt profoundly moral. That night, rumors spread through the barracks faster than the relentless Texas heat. Some insisted the Americans fed their dogs better than they fed the prisoners. Others swore the animals had their own kennel barracks, complete with fans and fresh water. One guard, it was whispered, brushed them daily. The stories proliferated like weeds, absurd yet somehow entirely believable, for everything in this strange captivity already defied all expectation. "They've turned our pride into their peacekeepers," someone muttered during the evening count. A wave of uneasy, quiet laughter rippled through the room. A few weeks later, during a work detail hauling lumber for new latrines, Becker finally saw one of the dogs up close. The MP handler, Corporal Sanders, his name tag clearly visible, was supervising the crew. The Rottweiler beside him lay comfortably in the shade, panting softly, its massive chest rising and falling with a slow, powerful rhythm. Becker found himself glancing towards it involuntarily. The dog met his gaze, then tilted its head, an expression of genuine curiosity in its dark eyes. For a fleeting second, Becker experienced something absurdly familiar, a memory of home, of his father's farm, of simpler creatures that guarded rather than killed. The feeling passed quickly, replaced by a strange heaviness he couldn't quite name. When a shift ended, Becker lingered behind, feigning to tie his bootlace. Sanders noticed his hesitation and said, in his slow, patient English, "You like him?" Becker paused, then nodded. The corporal smiled. "That's Rex, good boy." He patted the dog's powerful neck and added, "German breed. Huh? You folks make good dogs." The tone was friendly, almost teasing, yet the words landed on Becker like a confession. He looked away, a flush rising in his cheeks. For years, they had been told Germany produced the best of everything: cars, guns, soldiers, dogs. Now, even that deep-seated pride had been subtly leashed by the enemy. As weeks slowly stretched into months, the dogs became potent symbols the men simply couldn't ignore. Every evening, they observed the patrols move with clockwork precision, human and animal in perfect synchronicity, both confident, neither exhibiting cruelty. The fence, once a stark reminder of their defeat, gradually began to appear as a dividing line of contrasting philosophies. On one side, control born of fear. On the other, control forged through respect. Even Newman, Becker's workmate, once fiercely defiant, admitted one night, "They win wars differently than we do. Maybe that's why they win." Still, the sight of those powerful Rottweilers continued to gnaw at the prisoner's pride. Some joked bitterly that the dogs would soon forget their German commands. Others clung to dreams that upon their return home, they would reclaim their breeds, re-educate them back to unwavering loyalty. But deep down, many knew the hard truth. The dogs had adapted, just as the men themselves would ultimately have to. Becker frequently found himself studying the handlers more intently than the animals, attempting to decipher the strange, quiet calm that seemed to define these Americans. They never shouted, never threatened. They trusted obedience because they had painstakingly earned it. It was a kind of power the Reich, in its rigid ideology, had never truly comprehended. One afternoon, a sudden commotion shattered the camp's monotony. A young prisoner, barely 19 and desperate, attempted to slip under the fence during a supply delivery. The alarm blared, and the Rottweiler on patrol lunged forward, its chains snapping taut. Becker froze, expecting the familiar snarl, the savage attack. But it never came. The dog stopped just inches short of the boy, effectively blocking his path. It didn't bite. It didn't bark. It simply stood there, chest heaving, its piercing eyes locked on the trembling prisoner until the guard arrived. The control was surgical, almost compassionate. The Americans praised the dog with a single, approving word: "Good." That night, Becker found sleep impossible. He kept replaying that moment in his mind. The incredible restraint, the silent, unwavering authority, the profound lesson embedded within it. The next morning, he wrote in his small, camp-issued notebook, "Astor's strength is not found in violence. It is found in what one chooses not to do." Over time, the Rottweilers became an integral part of the camp's daily rhythm, a steady punctuation between mornings and nights, a bridge between old pride and a burgeoning new humility. The Germans began to sketch them, to give them secret names, as if understanding these animals meant understanding something essential about themselves. When mail arrived from home, bringing letters filled with despair, news of bombings, and the gnawing reality of hunger, the dogs remained a constant, quiet presence, stoic sentinels in a world that still, in some strange way, made sense. One evening, as the sun began its low descent, painting the Texas sky in hues of orange and gold, Becker watched a handler toss a stick for his dog just beyond the wire. The animal fetched it eagerly, its tail wagging furiously, pure joy in its movements. Becker found himself smiling, a spontaneous, unbidden expression. They even let them play, Newman observed softly beside him. Becker nodded. Yes, he replied, his eyes fixed on the powerful animal, leaping through the orange light. And they never forget to come back. He couldn't quite articulate why those words resonated so deeply within him. Perhaps it was the profound realization that even in captivity, there was something inherently noble about loyalty freely given. Perhaps it was envy. Whatever the reason, when the bugle called for lights out, Becker's last thought was not of war or loss, but of that magnificent dog, half German, half American, patrolling the edge of his world. And somewhere, deep inside, a quiet truth began to take shape, one that would undoubtedly haunt him long after the fences were gone. By late autumn, the air around Camp Bowie had cooled, and the mesquite trees cast long, crooked shadows across the dusty parade ground. The rhythm of captivity had settled into something that felt perilously close to normal. Men who had once marched in perfect columns across Europe now dutifully lined up for breakfast trays, carried lumber for repairs, or hoed cotton under the same vast sun as their captors. The Germans had, by now, ceased expecting cruelty. In its unexpected place, they found something far stranger, routine kindness. It manifested in small, almost imperceptible forms. A guard offering a shared cigarette, a medic carefully patching a blistered hand, a quiet voice saying, "Take your time, soldier." That last word, soldier, was what caught them most off guard. They were still being addressed as soldiers, not simply prisoners, as if their inherent dignity had inexplicably survived the surrender. For Becker, this subtle transformation had been slow, almost invisible in its progression. The days blurred into an endless cycle of work details, roll calls, and the same quiet jokes whispered in the barracks at night. Yet, somewhere between the clang of dinner trays and the low, reassuring bark of dogs beyond the wire, something deep inside him began to thaw. He started speaking more English, tentatively asking the guard questions. The Americans responded easily, their tone casual, almost teasing. "We're just doing a job, same as you did," one remarked. "Difference is, ours pays better." Becker laughed, startled by how natural and unforced the sound felt. Laughter, he realized, was a rare language exchange between enemies. The Rottweilers, too, had undergone a change in his perception. What had initially stirred feelings of humiliation now sparked something closer to fascination. Each patrol passed with predictable grace, animal and handler moving in perfect harmony. The Germans had learned the dogs' routines, their individual temperaments. Becker knew one by its gait alone, a younger dog, broad-headed with a small white patch on its chest. The handler called him Bruno. Whenever the work crew was stationed near the motor depot, Becker often saw Bruno lying comfortably under the shade of a truck, his tongue lolling in the heat, eyes half closed. The MP, a stocky man from Kansas named Miller, would scratch behind the dog's ears and mutter, "Good boy," keeping watch. Becker admired how effortlessly command and affection coexisted in that single gesture. One afternoon, Miller surprised him again. As Becker meticulously stacked lumber, the MP approached, carrying a tin bowl. "Water for the men," he said, setting it down near the crew. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "And for him, too." Bruno padded forward, sniffing the rim before lapping up the cool water. Miller chuckled softly. "See, he's German, but he drinks Texan." Becker offered a faint smile, unsure if it was a joke or a genuine olive branch. In that singular moment, the line between enemy and friend blurred irrevocably. The dog drank from the same bowl they did, and nobody questioned it. In the evenings, the camp's atmosphere softened palpably. The guards shared cigarettes. The prisoners sang, their voices low and melodic. From the guard tower, an MP might hum along quietly. The Rottweilers dozed near the gate, their chains slack, their loyalty utterly unquestioned. It was a strange kind of peace, born not of surrender, but of a growing, mutual understanding. Becker began writing letters home, attempting to describe it all. "They do not hate us," he wrote to his mother. "They treat even their dogs with fairness. I think this is their secret weapon, order without cruelty." He folded the letter carefully, uncertain if the censors would ever allow it to pass. The camp chaplain, an old Methodist minister with kind, tired eyes, visited the barracks each Sunday. He brought worn Bibles and a tone that never judged. Some Germans attended simply to feel human again, to hear words that weren't barked as orders. One morning, as Becker passed the small chapel tent, he saw Miller kneeling beside Bruno, bowing his head during the prayer. The sight unsettled him in a way he couldn't articulate. Even the dogs, it seemed, were included in this quiet, expansive mercy. Winter descended, bringing with it rain and mud, but also an unexpected warmth. Coffees were shared at the workshop stove, blankets patched by local women who volunteered their time. A few of the guards now spoke hesitant German, clumsy but undeniably sincere. "Guten Morgen, Becker," one said, grinning. The man mispronounced it, and Becker gently corrected him. They both laughed, a shared realization of the inherent absurdity of the situation. Teaching your jailer your own mother tongue. Still, pride dies hard. Not every man accepted the kindness without suspicion. Newman, Becker's old workmate, muttered that it was all mere propaganda, that the Americans were simply fattening them for some later use. "They want to make us soft," he grumbled one night, staring at the ceiling. "And they're winning." Becker didn't respond. Perhaps, he thought, softness was precisely what the world needed now. The Reich had taught hardness well enough. On Christmas Eve, the Americans erected a small, modest tree near the mess hall. They invited the POW choir to sing. Snowflakes fell softly, a rare occurrence for Texas, dusting the barbed wire in a delicate white. Guards stood respectfully beside the prisoners, hats in hand, while the Rottweilers watched from a few yards away, their breath misting in the cold air. When the Germans sang Still Nacht, their voices low and trembling, even the dogs seemed to fall silent. Becker's throat tightened as he sang, his voice merging with those of men who, only months ago, would have been shooting across a field at these very same soldiers. The final note faded into the hushed night, and for one fragile, suspended instant, the war felt impossibly, wonderfully far away. Afterward, Miller approached Becker, carrying a small, wrapped parcel. Inside was a piece of chocolate, stamped with an American eagle. From the Red Cross, Miller said simply, "Becker nodded, whispering, Danke." Miller merely shrugged. "Merry Christmas, pal." Behind him, Bruno wagged his tail once, as if in silent approval. That night, Becker couldn't sleep. He stared at the rafters, listening to the soft snores of exhausted men, the gentle rustle of rain on the tin roof. Beyond the fence, a Rottweiler barked once, sharp and brief, before silence once again reclaimed the camp. Becker thought of home, of Munich's bombed streets, of the broken faces he'd left behind. He realized, with a pang that felt like a sharp jab of guilt, that he was undeniably safer here, in the land of his supposed enemies, that his own family was under his own flag. The thought haunted him relentlessly. In January, the new year arrived quietly. News of the war filtered in through newspapers and rumor. The Allies crossing the Rhine, the Soviets advancing relentlessly on Berlin. The prisoners grew increasingly restless, caught between hope and dread. Yet, life inside the wire continued with the same strange civility. The dogs aged. Handlers rotated out, but the camp's gentle rhythm never broke. Becker noticed how Miller spoke to Bruno now, softer than before, as if addressing a cherished friend rather than a mere tool. One afternoon, Miller confided in him. "You know, when this is all over, I'm taking him home. He's earned it." Becker smiled faintly. "So have you," he replied, a quiet understanding passing between them. By March, the first whispers of repatriation reached the camp. The men buzzed with a potent mix of anticipation and dread. They longed desperately for home, yet simultaneously feared what they would find there. Becker wondered what, if anything, would remain of Germany, and perhaps more profoundly, what would remain of them. One evening, he walked near the fence and saw Miller kneeling beside Bruno, gently brushing his fur. He called softly through the wire, "Take care of him." Miller looked up, surprised by the sentiment. "Don't worry, pal," he said, a warm smile touching his lips. "He's family." For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, two soldiers from opposite worlds, now irrevocably bound by a dog that somehow belonged to both. In the fading light, Becker realized that captivity had achieved something no battle ever could. It had made him truly see the humanity on the other side. That night, when the bugles sounded for lights out, he lay awake, listening to the rhythmic pacing of paws beyond the fence. Each step sounded like a steady heartbeat, alive and bridging the vast space that had once separated enemy from friend. And somewhere deep inside him, Becker understood that the war had already begun to end, not in the shattered cities of Berlin or London, but right here, in a quiet camp in Texas, where Mercy had learned to wear uniform. By the spring of 1945, the war that had swallowed entire continents was finally cracking apart at its seams. In the newspapers that slowly filtered through the camp, the Germans read names that once commanded fear: Rhineland, Nuremberg, Berlin, now tragically written beside words like fallen and surrendered. The camp loudspeaker delivered updates in flat, dispassionate English tones, but every man understood the chilling message: the Reich was dying. Becker stood in the warm sunlight outside the barracks, watching the flagpole where the stars and stripes rippled lazily in the wind. Beyond the wire, Bruno and his handler paced their usual, unbroken path, the familiar rhythm of captivity still humming along. Yet, something indefinable in the air had subtly shifted. The guard spoke more softly. The dogs seemed calmer, their watchful eyes less intense. Freedom, Becker suddenly realized, was no longer a distant rumor. It was approaching, like a slow train gaining speed in the far distance. Rumors intensified that they would soon be sent home. Some men cheered quietly, a fragile sound of hope. Others, however, dreaded what home had become. They imagined cities flattened into dust, families scattered, their beloved homeland nothing but smoke and rubble. In the evenings, men gathered by the fence and watched the Texas sunset melt into a spectacular canvas of gold and red. "We will go back to nothing," Newman said one night, his voice heavy with despair. Becker shook his head slowly. "Not to nothing," he replied, a flicker of conviction in his eyes. "To something different." It sounded naive, even to him, but he desperately wanted to believe it. Perhaps, he thought, that belief was all they had left. As the days lengthened, the camp's strict atmosphere gradually loosened. Restrictions eased. The prisoners walked more freely within the wire. Guards greeted them by name, a small but significant gesture of recognition. Work details became less strenuous, and the sound of laughter slowly crept back into the air. One afternoon, Becker found himself helping Miller unload supplies from a truck. Bruno, now older and grayer around the muzzle, trotted contentedly beside them. "He's going home too," Miller said, gently rubbing the dog's flank. "No more war for him." Becker smiled faintly. "He has served both sides," he observed. "Maybe that makes him wiser than us." Miller chuckled softly. "Yeah," he agreed. "He never cared who won, just who was kind." The remark lingered with Becker for days. He had lived his entire life believing that obedience was the ultimate virtue, loyalty the paramount strength. Yet here, in a camp built by his enemies, it was compassion that commanded true respect. Even the dogs seemed to understand it. They enforced the rules with a calm certainty, never with cruelty. They were a living, breathing reminder of what discipline could truly be when untainted by ideology, firm, fair, and utterly free of hate. Watching them patrol, Becker reflected on how far he had come from the angry, proud man who first stepped off the train into the Texas dust. That man, he realized, had vanished somewhere between the fences and the breathtaking sunsets. Then, in early May, the announcement finally came. Germany had surrendered. The war was over. The camp fell into an astonished silence when a loudspeaker delivered the momentous words. No one shouted or cursed. It was as if the air had been suddenly punched from their lungs. Becker sat on the barrack steps, staring numbly at the dirt around him. Men wept quietly, their shoulders shaking. Some prayed. Others just stared, hollow-eyed, into the vast distance. Miller approached later with a cup of coffee, setting the steaming mug gently beside him. "Guess that's that," he said softly, his voice tinged with a quiet finality. Becker nodded, his own voice barely a whisper. "So it ends." Miller looked at him for a long moment. Then, with a profound shift in tone, replied, "Nah, now it starts." In the days that followed, the Germans helped dismantle parts of their own captivity. They systematically took down fences, meticulously cleaned barracks, and carefully packed supplies. For the very first time, Becker walked beyond the wire without a guard beside him. The open air felt both exhilarating and terrifying. He realized how accustomed he had become to boundaries, how safety had subtly begun to resemble confinement. Freedom, he thought, demanded a kind of courage he hadn't needed while in chains. One morning, as the last transport trucks prepared for departure, Becker found Miller and Bruno waiting at the gate. The dog sat calmly beside his handler, its tail occasionally brushing the dirt. Miller extended his hand. "Safe trip, Becker," he said, his grip firm. Becker hesitated for a moment, then clasped it firmly. "Thank you for everything," he said, struggling to find the right words. "For how you treated us. For how you treated him." He nodded towards Bruno. Miller smiled faintly. "He's a good judge of character," he replied. "He like you fellas." Becker's eyes lingered on Bruno, a silent farewell. "In Germany, they taught us to make him fierce," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Here, you taught him to be fair." Miller looked down at the dog and shrugged, a gesture of quiet wisdom. Same training, different heart. The whistle blew, a sharp, piercing sound. Becker stepped onto the truck bed, turning for one last look. Bruno stood watching him, head slightly tilted, as if memorizing the shape of his departure. For a single, suspended heartbeat, man and dog regarded each other across the space that had once profoundly divided captor and captive. Then the truck jolted forward, and the camp began to shrink behind him. The neat rows of barracks, the guard towers, the rippling flag. In the distance, the Rottweiler turned and trotted faithfully after his handler, disappearing into the golden sunlight. The journey home was long and profoundly uncertain. Through Louisiana, then the Carolinas, and finally across the Atlantic to Le Havre, Becker witnessed the widespread ruin of war everywhere he looked. Ports shattered, cities ghosted by fire. Yet, something deep inside him remained still, an unexpected calm. At night, when the ship's engines hummed their steady rhythm, he could almost hear the familiar pad of paws on the Texas earth, steady and patient. It reminded him of a promise unspoken, a kind of mercy that transcended nation or uniform. Months later, back in Munich, Becker found his home a mere skeleton of what it had once been. The streets were gray with dust, the windows gaping like empty eyes. His mother's letter, smudged and with trembling handwriting, awaited him at a neighbor's house. Thanking God he had survived. He walked the empty, scarred lanes, feeling both foreign and strangely familiar. Everywhere he looked, he saw ghosts of orders obeyed too well, the bitter legacy of unquestioning loyalty. He thought of the Americans, of Miller's easy kindness, of the way they had called him soldier without a trace of contempt. Most of all, he thought of the dogs, their silent discipline, their steadfast refusal to hate. One evening, while passing a ruined butcher's shop, he paused at the sound of soft barking. A Rottweiler pup, thin and trembling, was tied near the door. Becker crouched down, untied it, and gently lifted the small body into his arms. The dog licked his wrist once, trusting him instantly. Becker smiled, the first genuine smile he'd worn in months. "You'll do better," he whispered in German, his voice soft with emotion. "We both will." In time, the little dog became his constant companion. Becker trained it as he had in the old days, but differently now. There were no harsh words, no forced submission, only patience, calm repetition, and quiet authority. Neighbors occasionally chuckled, remarking that he spoiled the animal. He didn't care. When the dog followed him through the war-torn streets, people often smiled at the sight. A former soldier and a once-feared breed walking side by side through the rubble of a fallen empire, together building something gentler from the ruins. Years later, in interviews with historians, Becker would describe Camp Bowie as the strangest kind of victory. He said the Americans had conquered him not with force, but with profound decency. "They treated us like men," he recounted, "and in doing so, they reminded us how to be human again." Sometimes at night, he still dreamed of Texas, the dust, the barbed wire, the distant barking in the dark. He would wake with tears in his eyes, unsure if they were for what he had lost or for what he had, against all odds, found. Because in that camp, so far from home, he had learned the most unexpected truth of all, that mercy, once given freely, never truly ends. It travels like a well-trained dog, across borders and through the years, faithfully guarding what is left of the human soul.